All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. My research focused on mapping out the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety, or at least part of it. And last week, I talked about a clinical trial that was just conducted to explore whether psilocybin, sort of like the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, which is a psychedelic hallucinogen, whether or not psilocybin might be a viable treatment for depression. Well, a study was just published, just a bit before the results of that clinical trial were published, that helps to describe what exactly hallucinations are, or to be more specific, why we're even capable of having hallucinations. And I thought it might be worth exploring, the findings of that study, because they propose a pretty broad model that I think is pretty interesting. And so part of why I was drawn to this study is because it comports with the explanations of severe psychosis that I've seen in the past, and there's no doubt that the participants in that clinical trial, for the treatment of depression, were experiencing hallucinations, for sure. So why not explore a possible explanation of why they were experiencing those hallucinations, and therefore why we're even capable of experiencing hallucinations in the first place? Well, so this was a study that was published in eLife by Kenneth Wengler, Andrew Goldberg, George Chahine, and Guillermo Horga, or probably Guillermo Horga. Who are at the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia University, the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and the Department of Psychiatry at Yale. And, by the way, just a few people ask why I mention the names of people involved in these studies, and this is why. When you get into science, part of the job is to follow the work of specific people, and the people with whom they work, to follow, what they publish. So it's sort of like following the books that a specific author writes, or following the differences between the types of laptops or phones that various companies make, right? You can get a sense of the track record of a group of scientists from their history of work, just like you can get a sense of the quality of products that a given company puts out over the years. So anyways, this group hones in on a model called hierarchical perceptual inference, which is just a phrase that describes the emergence of incorrect concepts or even perceptions as a result of errors that arise from how the brain represents reality. So I know that even my interpretation of what hierarchical perceptual inference means is probably inscrutable, but this is actually a pretty intuitive dynamic. So first, imagine a hierarchy, your favorite hierarchy, like a hierarchy of needs, a hierarchy of government, or even a hierarchy of an inferno. What you'll notice is that these are organizations or organizational models with some items ranked above the others as a function of their authority, their function, or their relative control. And so those aren't super intuitive examples, but the point is that this group is corroborating a model of hallucinations and delusions that involves higher levels and lower levels. We can get rid of these. So higher levels and lower levels are the systems that enable us to both get a sense of what's literally happening around us, moment to moment, as well as the broader context in which those things are happening. So here's an example. You can see that there are some flowers behind me. You see them, and even if you don't know what specific type of orchid they are, Phalaenopsis, but pretty much the most common, you'd probably be pretty surprised if I just started eating those flowers one by one, right? So the lower level of that capability that you have, that you don't even notice, by the way, right, is that you recognize that you're seeing a flower. But then the higher level is that that this flower is not only never eaten, but it would be extremely strange if I just began eating them all of a sudden, in this moment, while I'm talking about, how it is that we have hallucinations and delusions. So the lower levels that these are flowers, right? Your sensory systems are accurately decoding the photons splashing up against your eyes, telling you that it's a flower. The higher level is that you'd be weirded out if I was munching on them while continuing to talk. Your inference of my intentions, the social context, and so on places those simple perceptions into a broader context. And that helps you understand what's happening right now, what's likely to happen to those flowers, and whether you'd feel that a given event would be absolutely strange and surprising if it involved those flowers. Lower level, higher level. Okay, so here's the basic argument that the scientists who wrote this study make. Hallucinations and delusions emerge from disruptions of the relationships between these hierarchical, items or processing. So, these relationships between lower processes and higher processes. So, in other words, like disruptions between the simple lower sensory inputs, you're seeing that these are flowers, and the more complex higher cognitive processing. You understand that this isn't a perfectly cooked lobster, right? And so it'd just be weird if I just started eating them. They note that the higher levels of this hierarchy involve more abstract belief states, and those processes take up a bit more time to bubble up into our conscious awareness, right? So this is probably somewhat intuitive as well, believe it or not. So here's an example. Have you ever been in the situation where somebody says something, but they're mumbling, or you're in a noisy environment and you just don't quite hear what they're saying right away, but after a second or two, after you've already said what, you actually do understand what they said, and you don't even quite know why. Like, why all of a sudden you do understand what it was they were saying when initially you didn't. So that's what we're talking about. That the early sensory experience of literally hearing sounds, didn't trigger understanding right away, but after a bit more contextual processing, like the movement of their lips, the other words that you did hear them say, and like the broader conversation that you've been having, you arrive at exactly what they said. And then, right after you said what, you already understand, what they're saying, right as they probably begin repeating the word that they said. It's sort of irritating when that happens, right? But it's also kind of remarkable that we're even capable of that kind of contextual processing, that we don't even have to hear the word a person says, but seconds later we can decode it. And it's just, this is all completely subconscious. So this group worked with 331 healthy control participants, and then 254 patients who were diagnosed with either schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. So in other words, they were comparing, the broad neural activity of people with and without schizophrenia. And this was a pretty expansive study. They did a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to get into everything that they did, but they highlight studies that suggest that higher levels of the neural hierarchy represent more and more abstract belief states, and those processes take longer periods of time than the simpler, purely sensory perceptions. And so this group found that there were differences in the timing of the responses that different parts of the brain exhibited when it came to both hallucinations and delusions. Specifically, those with schizophrenia who experience more severe delusions as opposed to like hallucinations, they seem to exhibit reactions in areas of the brain associated with more abstract, higher level interpretations. It took a bit longer for them, relative to controls. And those with more severe hallucinations tended to exhibit extended lower level regional processes, right? So in other words, like the neuronal processes underlying the ability of a person to decode that this is a flower, right, seem to take a bit longer in patients with schizophrenia who tended to experience hallucinations more frequently, while those who experienced delusions tended to have that same lengthened reaction within regions that enable you to realize that it would be strange if I started eating the flowers, right? So not only that, but their findings of this unique reaction of patients with schizophrenia who predominantly experience hallucinations seem to center on the auditory system rather than other sensory systems. And so, as opposed to like vision or touch. And that sort of makes sense, right? So, it makes sense given that hallucinations that are experienced by those with schizophrenia tend to be auditory, right? Predominantly auditory hallucinations. So, that's a pretty cool finding. The study wasn't perfect because 93% of the patients in this study were taking antipsychotics, right, to treat their schizophrenia. And so there are a bunch of problems with interpreting the results, but they do acknowledge that they've seen similar differences in brain responses, even when they control for the effects of medication. So, regardless, it's just worth keeping in mind that there is some neuropharmacology at play here that's not, doesn't necessarily characterize schizophrenia. But anyways, that said, this study is interesting for a few reasons. So first of all, it's an interesting possible explanation for why it is that some people diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to exhibit more hallucinations while others tend to exhibit more delusions, right? There's, different manifestations of schizophrenia. But the neuropharmacologist in me can't help but wonder if this might help to reveal a serotonergic role or serotonin-related role in the regulation of hallucinations, with the types of substances I discussed last week in mind. So psilocybin and psychedelic drugs. Given that these substances are well known for their effects on sensory perception, as well as cognition, of course, But, particularly sensory perception, their effects on sensory perception, vision, these types of things, it's sort of unique to this class of drugs. And so I have to wonder about the involvement of serotonergic signaling in regulating this balance, between sensory inputs or the lower level processing, again, seeing the flower, and then cognitive processes, knowing that higher level processing is that these are not for eating, right? But so ultimately, it's some cool evidence that perception is the byproduct of this balance between taking incoming information and understanding that incoming information. And any perturbation or neuronal quirk that might cause schizophrenia that alters this balance between higher and lower levels results in errors that compromise our ability to either get accurate information about our environments, or errors in how we understand and react to that information about our environments. And so this whole hierarchical model reminds me of a project that came out, I guess, more than several years ago at this point, put out by Google, called Deep Dream, which, if you're unfamiliar with Deep Dream, it's totally worth checking out. But quickly, the short story is that the software that Deep Dream is it's designed to detect like faces and patterns in various images. Ultimately, the goal of this program is to enable Google to automatically classify types of images, like images of dogs or trees or people. But what they did with Deep Dream is that they tweaked this program a bit to produce something kind of strange and kind of wonderful. So for Deep Dream, they basically ran that process, that recognition process, in reverse. After having trained their program, their system, to recognize various shapes, and objects, they ran in reverse, such that the program was basically like projecting related shapes onto images. So, rather than like fairly accurately detecting that like this is a picture of a jellyfish, or I guess multiple jellyfish, they would run iterations of these detection events, resulting in the program detecting the presence of things that kind of sort of resemble its own memory of other images that it had seen, and then projecting those images that it detects onto the original image, right? So after 10 rounds of these detection iterations, you can see it begins to detect all kinds of strange animals and buildings and spiders, and even what looks like a person up towards the top maybe. And then they run it 50 times. And you can see, the jellyfish is completely absent at this point. And, you're just seeing like a bunch of like weird morphed animals, like particularly dogs to my eyes. And, it's just like completely strange chaos. And so the reason that this example came to my mind is that the system that they set up to make Deep Dream is actually rather similar to how the brain does the same thing. The human brain does the same thing. There are lower level inputs that then feed into higher level detection and recognition and so on. And so, it works rather well when the relationships between these different levels of detection and recognition and stuff, that system works pretty well. But when you manipulate those relationships, between the lower and the higher level systems, instead of recognizing a jellyfish, it makes projections onto the starting image and then ultimately sees things that aren't there. Just because that balance between those different levels of detection and recognition, lower and higher levels, have been sort of messed up. And so, by the way, in case you're interested, there are folks out there who've made their own versions of Deep Dream that you can check out. One that I checked out was it's called deepdreamgenerator.com. And so so we'll do boop boop boop. Here's an image or here's what it produced for an image that I use for my like avatars. It's pretty fun, pretty cool. So anyway, like similar errors are at the core of what these scientists are describing and what they ultimately identified in the brains of people with schizophrenia. And what's fascinating is that a ton of people who've experienced psychedelic hallucinogens, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, so people who've experienced those substances have remarked about how reminiscent the images that are produced by Deep Dream are of the experience that the drugs can have on sensory perception. It's not the same, of course, but it's sort of similar. And, it just strikes me as like a super fascinating convergence of both neuropharmacology, the drugs, and computer programming onto essentially the same fundamental system of how sensory information and cognition interact with one another to deliver our sense of reality, higher level and lower level relationships. So pretty cool, huh? And so that's what I have for you today. It's Ian Warhol. Yeah, sort of. Hey, Aiden. It's a cool website. I recommend you check it out. Deepdreamgenerator.com. And it's not only like the deep dream, like this is like mimicking Deep Dream, the Google one. But then they have other ones, like they have their own sort of like styles of manipulation that can produce really strange and wonderful images. So you should check it out. Maybe I'll put it in the description, just so you guys can check it out. All right, why don't we start the live half? Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania, where I studied the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety, sort of like mood and addiction, but specifically anxiety. And so just now on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, I talked about a study that came out that proposes and justifies a model to explain why we have hallucinations, like why we can even have hallucinations, using patients with schizophrenia specifically as like their group, right? That they were comparing to, people without schizophrenia or controls, and it's pretty neat. And then I also got into this program or this system, this like Google derived system called Deep Dream, and at least from my perspective, it seems like Deep Dream is an interesting kind of parallel system to how this group of scientists identified the sort of genesis of hallucinations. And theoretically, their model could apply to not just schizophrenia, but probably to the hallucinations that people have just when they're experiencing psychosis, but then also when people take hallucinogenic drugs. So check it out, youtube.com/anthropoid. All right, how do we account for hallucinations that people in deep grief sometimes experience? Yeah, Evolverman. So, to be clear, hey, what's up, Joe? Good to see you. To be clear, like they were specifically studying patients with schizophrenia, but and also they didn't come up with this model of basically what are called higher level and lower level processing, but theoretically it would still apply. It would still apply to hallucinations that people have when they're when they're experiencing severe depression or grief, or just bouts of psychosis. But then also when people take drugs that typically aren't hallucinogenic, like very, very high levels of amphetamine or even cocaine can induce psychosis, but also hallucinations. They tend to skew a little bit more paranoid, and that's probably part of that whole same system of higher level and lower level processing. Looks like somebody's calling in. Let's talk. Oh, cool. Oh, let me get my pencil ready. So it looks like we're connected. So what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there? Kent? Can you hear me, Kent? Hi.
Yeah, I'm in Sarasota, Florida.
Cool. So Kent in Sarasota. Good to hear from you. So what's on your mind?
Yeah, I love it down here. So, the part of the brain that ADD is always controversial. I've done a lot of research on it, and I think I have myself. And I wanted to ask you this a long time ago. You are the one that diagnosed my face blindness. It has helped me so much, I can't believe it.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I certainly didn't diagnose it, but
Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean diagnose. You acknowledged a certain piece of research on that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear it.
And I'm able to really focus in on things a lot closer and realize why I couldn't vision. Anyway, what I'm really looking at, and I don't want to take a lot of your time, is the ADD thing, the ADD and ADD-HD. What part of the brain would that surface in?
Well, so we don't know with 100% certainty, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that a specific circuit in the brain called the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit, don't worry about the name, you can remember the term dopamine.
Right.
Basically, this is a circuit that's involved in a lot of different things, but with regards to ADHD, it is a signal that basically determines how long a person will devote conscious energy and effort to any given task. So like how long, for example, let's say you are, trying to understand prosopagnosia, right? Face blindness. And, you could spend, 15 hours straight just reading articles, collecting information, or but that would seem like a very long time. alternatively, you might want to understand prosopagnosia and read into it, but you can't really get yourself or motivate yourself to read for more than 15 minutes at a time, right? And so that the circuit that determines, or at least in part determines, how much time a person will devote to anything is that same circuit, is the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit. And it's essentially the levels of dopamine that are being released in a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And it just so happens that ADHD medications, Adderall, Ritalin, their sort of, site of action, their mechanism of action really centers on that same circuit, which is probably why they're basically the most effective treatments that we have for people who have ADHD. But that would be, it's a circuit of neurons. So it's the circuit in terms of anatomy, it extends from a part of the brain called the ventral tegmental area. So that's sort of like, if you imagine your brain is a boxing glove. The VTA, or the ventral tegmental area, dopaminergic part of the brain, is sort of like where your wrist meets your fist, right? So it's sort of like where the brainstem kind of plugs into the broader, cerebrum. And then those neurons then project, they send dopamine almost to the front of the brain, and they release dopamine. So that's sort of like the main kind of nugget of this neuroanatomy. It's always going to be more complicated than that, but that's the sort of main circuit that we've at least identified so far.
It's specifically it's a specific function though of dopamine. So if the dopamine were inhibited, what does? But the thing with the speed, the amphetamines, doesn't that damage brain cells in and of itself, neural cells in and of itself, and does that inhibit the dopamine?
Right. So it certainly can. Amphetamine on its own at certain doses, let's call them therapeutic doses, isn't really associated with excitotoxicity, with the death of dopamine neurons. But high levels of amphetamine, or certainly methamphetamine, which is significantly more potent.
Oh, that's what I messed up. Okay.
Yeah, no, you didn't mess up. I mean, you're not wrong. It's just.
I mixed up the research
okay.
with the high doses of methamphetamine. I just mixed up the research. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so basically what, both amphetamine and methamphetamine more effectively, let's say, they both drive those neurons to fire at increased frequencies, and that produces elevated release of dopamine. And at lower levels, so you just have a bit more dopamine, and so, essentially anybody, like even if you give amphetamine, Adderall, or Ritalin, they have sort of similar pharmacology, not the same, but similar. If you were to give that to somebody who doesn't have ADHD, they will also experience the effect of focusing on a task that they would otherwise find difficult to focus on, which is why Adderall has been sort of a significant problem within college and high school. Yeah, so it basically enables kids to sit down and write a paper, bang out a paper in 9 hours, right, the night before it's due. It's not always that. Like there is this sense, at least among a lot of these kids, that taking Adderall will enable them to study to then achieve higher scores on like the SATs and stuff like that. Which, by the way, just to be clear, there's no evidence that that's actually true. But anyways, so that's why it's the same circuit, but in the case of somebody with ADHD, the way that circuit functions is just different. And so, that's part of the reason for why young people with ADHD find it difficult to, focus in class, or, find it difficult to sort of function, let's say, normally, or as people without ADHD do. But, the interesting thing about ADHD for me is that it is not like exclusively a deleterious condition, right? It's not like, it doesn't have to be debilitating, and there are some sort of advantages to having, or it seems, to having something like ADHD. These folks tend to be quite creative, quite dynamic, and so the question for me isn't like how do we correct the brain of somebody with ADHD, but rather how do we provide the tools that would enable them to exploit those gifts while still being able to function. Yeah.
Exactly. But how does this tie in with what we talked about the face blindness business. I can see how I could visualize how I missed things. I didn't do well on tests. Wasn't ADHD. Well, I was a C student. I went to school with David Letterman, for God's sake. But I went on to, other things and published and stuff like that. But the face blind, I can't vision things. Like I'll say, well, God, I'm lost. I don't know where I am. It was actually this whole thing, all my failures that I've had, and all those successes had to do with this face blindness. Never would that have occurred to me in a million years if we hadn't talked about it. And I've definitely got it.
That's interesting. I mean, so you're bringing up two things actually, and so prosopagnosia is the face blindness that you're describing. But then there are studies that of a sort of controversial condition called aphantasia, and in fact, I think I have that, right? Or I have the brain of somebody with aphantasia. It's not like a disorder or anything. It's just, there's a distribution of different, neurobiological anatomies, right? And so, I have my entire life have never understood what people meant when they said visualize something, like visualize hitting the baseball or visualize.
You brought that up before.
Yeah.
You've talked about that in previous sessions of that aphantasia thing. And I remember you saying that, but I didn't know it was, oh my God, really?
Yeah, isn't it wild? Yeah. And so, Javier is bringing up the fusiform gyrus, which is like critical to prosopagnosia. And in fact, people, who previously were fine and could recognize faces, no problem, when they have a stroke and it happens to be near the fusiform gyrus, they develop prosopagnosia and they lose the ability to understand faces. But so just so everybody's on the same page with aphantasia, because I find it a very interesting kind of concept.
Wow.
So what I mean by this is, if I asked everybody to visualize a butterfly sitting in my hand, right?
Yes.
And then we asked, everybody to score from 1 to 5. If 5 is like, I literally experience the visual experience of seeing a butterfly, versus I see 0, zip, nothing. I understand what you mean by butterfly, but I don't experience any visual experience. There'll be a range, like, I've done this sort of like, informal survey myself with my friends, scientists, neuroscientists, and there's a difference. Like, people will say, for me, it's like, I see nothing. But then, I'll talk to, my former colleagues in the lab, neuroscientists trained to understand the visual system and stuff, and they'll say, no, it's a 5. I am experiencing a 5. And it's just like, it's sort of mind-blowing to me. But anyways, so I also have the brain of somebody who's incapable of truly visualizing or experiencing that component of human consciousness.
But how do you visualize your surgery, your neurons? The receptors float on. It's like it floats back and forth, and you do your surgery. Don't you visualize that first in your unbelievable vocabulary, able to recall, to see, when I say see areas of the brain, but you're saying you can. You don't visualize these areas. For example, the prefrontal cortex or the mesial cortex. You don't function. You don't visualize. You don't visualize when you do your surgery. You look at a microscope. You're just looking in real time and getting it. You don't see.
So I would say, on my scale, I'm probably like a 0.5 or like a 1. Like, I definitely, like, the only way that I could have passed organic chemistry, which is a challenging class for a lot of people, was visualizing, how various molecules would interact with each other and the shapes of molecules. In fact, I don't think you can pass OChem without being able to do that. But for me, what I'm calling visualizing is really just, conceiving of what it would be like if, you had a 6-member ring interacting with another 6-member ring, or like you're saying, the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic circuit, like what it looks like, literally like what it would look like. But there is 0 visual experience. Like, I would imagine that if somebody were imaging, had me in an fMRI, there would be essentially, very little neuronal activity in my occipital lobe, whereas for somebody who can, they probably do have elevated, occipital cortical activity. But this is pure speculation. So I wouldn't say that I do not visualize, but it's not an actual visual perceptual experience, which it sounds sort of like gibberish, but that's where I'm at.
No, not at all. No, it's completely. I hate to say this, it's completely clear.
Right, I can see it. Yeah, right.
I think I'm being healed.
Very nice. Well, listen, Kent, as always, wonderful to talk to you. Thanks for calling in.
Oh, thank everybody got. You cleared up so many things in my life. I taught gifted chemistry. Remember the one molecule where the one guy was something, he visualized a snake biting its own tail and rolling down the hill, and we came up with a chemical thing.
Huh? No, it's escaping me.
There was a type of chemistry, and he saw a snake rolling down the hill, and he did something with. Anyway, see, I can't visualize, so I can't explain it. But anyway, I taught chemistry, and the only way I could do it is having kids do a little simple experiment. I couldn't visualize one or why. Again, you've explained something. Okay, I'll let you go. Thank you so much. You just, this is so clear to me. I can't believe it.
Well,
I think I'm healed.
I appreciate it, man. Yeah, thanks for calling in. I'll talk to you again soon.
Well, I appreciate you very much. You're wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll let you go. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah, I've been chatting with Kent off and on for years at this point. Okay, so I know I missed a lot of comments here. So, Scott, good to see you, Surfer Scott. You never have to apologize to me. You have eyes like a meth addict. Do I? Well, it'd be interesting to see what they would look like if I was actually on meth. Okay. Can you talk about positives of psychedelics and fighting depression and anxiety? Well, Benny boy, I will give you the short story, but then you could go onto youtube.com/anthropoid, and last week I talked about a clinical trial of psilocybin, which is like the active ingredient, the thing that makes magic mushrooms magical, for the treatment of depression. So you can check that out. I dive into the study, not extensively, but just a bit. And in fact, funny enough, just like 2 days ago, I work in science policy now, and there are some bills being debated after the passage of decriminalization or the legalization of medical applications for psilocybin in Oregon and in Washington D.C. Now other states are beginning to explore, like, hey, maybe we should consider this, including New Jersey, which is where I work. And it turns out that there is going to be a new clinical trial of psilocybin for the treatment of opioid addiction for people who are currently being treated with Suboxone, just sort of like methadone. It's not the same, but sort of similar. Yeah, for the treatment of opioid addiction. Kind of exciting, and it's going to start literally next month. They're still recruiting, by the way, so you can just check that out if you're interested. I'm frankly I'm a little bit more skeptical of that than just for depression, but I mean there are data that suggest that psilocybin might be beneficial for the treatment of tobacco addiction. And so there might be some interesting serotonergic mechanism that if we could just tweak or exploit, it might help people, who are, addicted to some of the most addictive drugs in the world. But yeah, so beyond that, those are some of the, potential benefits of psilocybin. There's also evidence that psilocybin is beneficial for people suffering from depression as a function of end of life, terminal cancer and these types of things. And so, what we're seeing right now with this class of drugs, finally, frankly, from my perspective, is this very rapid expansion of interest in this class of drugs, not just from like a legal perspective, like, does it make sense to put people in prison for using these substances or having them, but also potential therapeutic applications. So that's very exciting for me. This has always been a category of drugs that has been extremely interesting to me. Just from the perspective of a neuroscientist, like what we can learn about human consciousness by understanding the pharmacology of these substances, and then therefore how those systems in the brain with which they interact function in regulating consciousness. So it's sort of an exciting time from a pharmacological perspective. But yeah, you can check out that clinical trial if you want. youtube.com/anthropoid. Last week, Javier brings up the fusiform gyrus. Is it more left-handed or right-handed people who become sick and died from this corolla? I assume you're referring to coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2. No, I haven't seen any evidence that handedness plays any role. I would be very, very surprised if it did. Rather, however, I do think that there are data that are emerging that do suggest that there may be genetic determinants of the severity of the response that people have to SARS-CoV-2. There is this weird thing about this virus that some people, they don't even know that they ever had it. I could have had it, and I just didn't know. Or some people, a lot of people just have a sort of mild reaction. It's unpleasant, of course, but fairly mild in the scheme of things. And then obviously some people, it's fatal, and there has to be some reason for that. It's not just going to be purely like the roll of a dice. or of a dye. But and honestly, there is a story that's emerging that I'm finding quite interesting. And I'm not an immunologist, obviously. I did have to study immunology in grad school, which was awful. But some potential genetic differences in a component of the immune system called the complement system. Not complement, but complement. It's just one of the various sort of arms of the immune system. And there might be some genetic features that people can have that will determine just how much their complement system reacts to the virus, and then therefore how many, a predisposition to experiencing that cytokine storm that we always hear about, that is really the thing that is the most dangerous about SARS-CoV-2, at least as far as we're aware at this point. But yeah, handedness, while genetic, in fact, it's genetic, but it's not exclusively inherited. It's not like determined exclusively by the genes you inherit from your parents. There's like this interesting sort of epigenetic, whatever, regulatory mechanism, this event that happens as our nervous system is developing, actually mostly within the spinal cord, which is very strange. I mean, it's not that strange. It'd be stranger if it was in like your toenails, but that seems to predict with very, very high confidence whether or not somebody is going to be left or right-handed. It's kind of cool. All right. Hey, Holistic Deb. Good to see you. Butterflies. Isn't prosopagnosia linked with Alzheimer's disease? It can be, for sure. It doesn't have to be, though. I mean, it's dementia in general. So, Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia. In fact, you know what I learned 2 days ago? And I didn't know this before, which is kind of embarrassing, is that about half of the people who have Alzheimer's disease, upon autopsy, when people are trying to understand what happened in their brain to verify if they had Alzheimer's disease, turns out about half of them also have elements of other forms of dementia. So you have Alzheimer's disease, the most common, but then frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, all of these different avenues that all arrive at a very similar conclusion, which is dementia, but by different mechanisms. Aggregates, amyloid beta plaques, neurofibrillary tangles in Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body aggregates in Lewy body dementia, obviously. And so, yeah, it turns out that like half of Alzheimer's patients also have elements of other forms of dementia, which is, I think, an important thing that I'm embarrassed I didn't know. Hey, Layback Dre, good to see you. But isn't memory different than visualizing? Yes. Yeah, you're right about that, Dre. Hello, sir. How are you feeling? I'm feeling okay. Pretty good. Wouldn't mind getting a little bit more sleep these days, but, pretty good. I can't complain. Put it that way. I wonder if people with eidetic memories have super active brain centers associated with visualization. Yeah, that's interesting. You know what? Actually, I think there have been studies that, people who, are assessed to have particularly effective memories, that there is, and so eidetic memory, for people who aren't familiar, that's what we might call photographic memory. It's like a perfect, ability to like perfectly recall what a page looked like or something. Certainly not the way my memory functions, but I had friends in high school, the valedictorian, who was a brilliant guy, kind of a weirdo, but brilliant guy. And he said that that's how he studied, is that he would just remember what the page looked like. I sort of feel like he might have been faking that a little bit, like just trying to come across as like, an X-Men, or whatever. But anyways, yeah, I'm pretty sure that there was a study of, there are people, it's very rare, but there are people who can demonstrate unbelievable memory. Being able to remember the most esoteric and niche, components of their experience years and years ago. And the name Zach is coming to mind. I think there's a kid named Zach. But anyways, I think that they did do some neuroimaging, and they found elevated levels of activity in the visual cortex and the occipital lobe. All right, can I be added to the call? Oh, geez, duh, gosh, Ian. All right, so I don't know who called in first, but we will start with Dre.
Hello?
Hey, Dre, looks like we're connected. Where are you calling from?
I'm from Miami, man. How's it going, bro?
Not bad. I used to live in Miami. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what causes psychosis and what's the solution?
Psychosis? What? So in what context?
Like, how people, like, picture stuff in their mind, but it's not really there. Like, what's the word I'm
not fantasize, but have like illusions and stuff.
Okay. So like hallucinations or
Yeah.
like that kind of thing. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I just talked about that on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. There was a study that came out. Here's a short story. So basically, the way that our sort of conscious experience works at a very fundamental level is that we have our sensory systems. We can see things, hear, touch, smell, and those systems give us really simple information about what's happening around us. Like, you can smell bacon, right? And you're like, that you smell the bacon, right? That's the lowest level, right? But then that if I smell bacon, then somebody's probably cooking bacon, and it's probably in the kitchen, and I can probably go eat some, right? Those are the higher level interpretations of a sensory experience, right? And so this study that I talked about basically showed that for people with schizophrenia who have, experienced hallucinations, usually they're auditory hallucinations. Usually they're hearing things that aren't actually happening, but there can be visual hallucinations too. That those folks, that basically the parts of the brain that are associated with hearing things, but then sensory systems in general, like seeing things, they take a longer time to process information, to process that incoming sensory information. And what that means at a granular level, it's unclear. But basically what they suggest is that there's this relationship between, seeing things, hearing things, and then understanding those things. There's this relationship, higher level, lower level. And in people who have hallucinations, that relationship is messed up. And so, instead of like only getting visual information from their environment, only seeing what's actually there, that they misunderstand, or the information is not delivered correctly or accurately. And so as a result, they can hallucinate, right? That their sensory systems are just, they're not providing accurate representations of incoming information. And so that's one example. But like for people who, let's say, have taken a hallucinogen, like magic mushrooms or LSD or something, theoretically the same thing is happening there, where these drugs interact with parts of the brain that regulate, that enable us to see things and hear things, right? And when you manipulate how those systems are working, then you can have all kinds of sensory distortions. You can see patterns in the walls or see faces in the clouds and these types of things. But yeah, I know that was like sort of a broad, maybe a little bit unclear explanation, but basically it's the relationship between our sensory systems that give us information about our environment and the systems in our brain that help us to understand that information.
Right. I had one last question that had to do with the brain, because someone was asking earlier, but can excessive viewing of pornography over years, over a decade, can that affect the brain chemicals, like the dopamine level, and make you look at people differently, as material?
So it's still a controversial topic, actually, but there's definitely evidence to suggest that yes, it has an effect, right? And so the simple answer is yes. That's not unique to pornography. Like anything that you do, any information that you provide to your brain will change your brain, right? You learn from every experience you have. Even if you're just sitting in a room with white walls staring at a wall, that will change your brain over time, right? And so there have been studies that suggest that pornography in and of itself is not damaging. It doesn't hurt your brain. The psychology, however, which is what I think you're more interested in, that's up for debate. And there are definitely people who, who suggest that, while it can be benign, while it doesn't need to hurt you, if you develop a compulsive relationship with pornography where, it seems more like, an addiction almost. That, of course, is an undesirable state of affairs, right? Whether or not it's damaging the brain, it doesn't matter, right? It's the psychology that matters. And so it's more complicated than just yes, it's bad for you. It doesn't damage your brain, but it does change, it does change your brain, and it does, it will influence your psychology. And my bet, this is speculation, is that it isn't the same for everybody, and past life experience can make it so that people are more vulnerable to developing compulsive relationships with pornography. or whatever it might be, right? Just some kind of trauma or whatever, some quirk of life makes people a little bit more vulnerable. And it's not that the pornography is damaging their brain; it's just that they are like vulnerable to having suboptimal or negative relationships with it.
Thank you for your answer, man. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, no, thanks for calling in. I hope to talk to you again.
All right, goodbye.
From Miami. Bienvenidos a Miami. Oh wait, there was somebody else calling in too. Sorry about that. Claudio. You'll have to forgive me for probably horribly mispronouncing your name. But let's see, will we connect? Let's see, I'll let that work for a little while. Hello, 900 Alley 90. Yeah, sorry, Claudio. It looks like it's not connecting. If you want to try calling back in, I'll keep an eye out. Sometimes the second time does work. Ketamine versus hallucinogenic. So ketamine is a hallucinogen, but it's not a psychedelic hallucinogen. So it's some people would call it a dissociative anesthetic. So at the heart of the difference is their pharmacologies. Psychedelic hallucinogens tend to be serotonergic in their effect. They interact with serotonin receptors, or they change the way serotonin is trafficked. Whereas ketamine is glutamatergic. It just binds a different kind of receptor that regulates different parts of consciousness. And so as a result, you can still have hallucinations. They're just not of the same quality. Oh, cool. It looks like we're connected, Claudio. Is that your name? And if it is, where are you calling from? Claudio, can you hear me?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Where are you calling from? Claudio? You might need to turn up the volume, or this is too bad.
I'll try to join again. This is your image got frozen here.
Of course. Okay. Well, I'll keep an eye out. So anyways, ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. NMDA binds glutamate, and let's say whatever psilocybin, magic mushrooms, or whatever, they bind serotonin receptors. Most importantly, the 5-HT2A receptor, but also other serotonin receptors, serotonergic proteins. Did you answer my question? If yes, what was it caused my connection is bad now? Oh geez, sorry, George. Oh wait, we have a bunch more people calling. Okay, let's try it one more time, Claudio. Maybe third time is the charm. All right, Claudio, we're connected. What's on your, or where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Florianopolis, Brazil.
Oh, cool. Okay. What's on your mind?
So I have a question. I teach English as a second language to Brazilian students, and my question has to do with the phenomenon I noticed in lessons, but also I noticed while I was learning English, and that has to do with the fact that it seems that we can, for a long period of time, mispronounce a word and hear that word being correctly pronounced by many different people, but it seems that our brain never registers that. Like, for instance, the word to say, the third person singular, you would say he says, she says, but I recall for many years I would just say he says, she says. Up until one moment it dawned on me that I was speaking wrongly. I was misspeaking it, and why it happens. I mean, is there a filtering in our ears that tells the brain, this is okay, say this is right. What it says is different, but never mind, or something like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. So I'm not an expert in language processing or anything like that, but I do know that there have been studies that suggest that once we get to a certain age, specifically the consonants, so the T's, the D's, these types of sounds that we make, seem to get kind of hardened. Like, it seems like if you learned Russian, or if you learned Japanese or Chinese first, right, there's a unique set of consonants and sounds, right, that you use in your language. And so I think it's around, like, I can't remember specific, it's like early adolescence, I believe, where basically it becomes significantly more difficult to learn completely novel sounds, how to make them. And so as a result, what happens is that people, instead of being able to, or learning how to form the tongue shapes that you need to form, like particularly in American English, the R sound is a very strange sound relative to most languages, and it's very difficult to learn. It's why it's one of the hardest things for babies, or young humans to learn. But so as a result, what happens is that because your ability to generate these new sounds gets sort of like hardened in place, you essentially instead you co-opt sounds that you already can make from your mother tongue to sort of as a simulacrum, or as like a sort of a version of the intended sound. So like a classic one for people who are primarily who primarily speak Chinese is the L sound is they don't really have like an identity. Well, they do. Yeah, that's not a great example. But anyways, that's the fundamental sort of framework, is that at a certain age it becomes very difficult to learn how to move your tongue in totally new ways. And it's also part of the reason for why like young people can learn languages like that. Like I have a 1.5, almost 2-year-old daughter, and every day she like learns how to learns a completely like 5-10 new words. Whereas for me, if I was trying to learn Brazilian Portuguese, which I really, really wish I had learned when I was younger because it's such a beautiful language, it would take me weeks, to even master just a couple. And so it's like the same fundamental property of an adult brain that makes it hard to learn a new language is the same thing that makes it difficult to correct mispronunciations. Yeah,
to the capacity to speak.
I know. Yeah, I don't blame you for focusing in on that, but I've never seen any evidence that it's actually like a sensory difference. It's not like people aren't even hearing the correct pronunciation. It's that it is just that much more difficult to make those new sounds. So it's more of a language production thing rather than a language comprehension thing. At least from the research that I read years ago at this point. So maybe there is something new that we know, but that's my understanding of it.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for calling in. Brazilian Portuguese is, I think, the most beautiful language of all of them. Like, I think they just nailed it. It's like listening to a song. It's so lovely. The human brain is the matrix, sort of. Oh no. Oh, that's too bad. Tiger Bad Boy, looks like we didn't connect. So let's try. I think your name is Rob, or what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Yeah, you got me? Sorry about that.
No problem. So what's your name? Is your name Robert?
Yeah, it is. I'm calling from Dallas, Texas.
Awesome. Robert in Dallas. What's on your mind?
So I've got kind of a left turn here. I'm not sure if this is something you can help me out with, but my dad, about 2 years ago, was diagnosed with autoimmune encephalitis.
Okay.
And he still has about a 30-year black beard where he doesn't remember anything. Excuse me. But I'm wondering, he's physically gotten better, but it's like he still cannot remember anything basically from like 1980 to about 2 years ago.
Wow.
Will
And
that get better?
will it get better? Okay, so and you said it was encephalitis. That's what he was diagnosed with. Yeah.
Correct.
And what was the cause? Do you know what the cause was? Was it an autoimmune?
No. Yeah, it was autoimmune. Yeah.
It was.
It was the one. If you named them off, I'd be able to tell you, but it's the one that's common with older men. I know there's one that's also common with younger females, but he had the one that was. I mean, I know it's very uncommon, but that's the one he had.
Well, I mean, it all comes down to whether or not he has received any kind of treatment. If the autoimmune, activity is under control, then, basically, like, what you're referring to is called retrograde amnesia, where, your ability to recall past experiences is compromised. And essentially, like, your ability to access that information is compromised. as opposed to anterior grade amnesia, which is you can remember all those things, which is probably what most people associate with amnesia, with Alzheimer's disease and stuff like that, where starting at a given moment when the amnesia begins, you cannot form new memories. And so if he, generally speaking, you can have one or the other. You can have both, of course, but and so if he had that autoimmune condition during all those years, it might be the case that just those experiences weren't stored, and so there's nothing there to access. But alternatively, it's not, in other words, if he is now forming memories, fine, then he'll have access to these memories, assuming that there isn't a reappearance of the encephalitis. But if those memories just weren't being formed at the time because of the autoimmune condition, then yeah, I mean it's unfortunate, but I would imagine that it'll be very, very difficult to just spontaneously remember. And it's also like memory is very complicated, right? It's not like saving a file to a hard drive, right? You remember bits and pieces of experiences, and it could be the case that while he doesn't remember, if you were to ask him, what was, I don't know, did you go to any concerts, in the 80s or whatever, he might not be able to recall that. But if he then hears a song or something like that, that might jostle a memory. There might be sort of bits and pieces of those experiences that are available, but because of the condition, it's not equivalent to a complete, comprehensive memory. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, that's okay. So if I'm understanding you right, he had the encephalitis basically for the 30 years. It just had a trigger point two years ago approximately that kind of triggered it. He was in the hospital for 3 months or so, and that was it. So it had been going on for that time period. That's kind of related to what memory loss?
It could be that, or if he was fine all those years, then...
Yeah, he was.
Oh, he was. Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So in that case, then there is some, there's more hope for that, right? Because here's what I imagine happened. And, again, I'm not a physician, I'm a scientist. But whatever pathology arose from that condition, if it was like an acute event, and then all of a sudden you could tell he knew something was wrong, then I would imagine that just the structures that enable that underlie those memories were somehow damaged. Not necessarily like eliminated. It's not like they're gone forever, but they're just damaged. And so yes, given some time, there is definitely the possibility that those memories can be accessed again after the sort of injury has healed, or at least has recovered a bit, right? But that process would, if it's possible, would take some time, because you're literally relying on like synapses to grow again, proteins to be synthesized, and that takes weeks, So yeah, that's what I would expect. Just give it some time and work at it, right? Like,
Sure.
Whatever, I don't really have any like therapeutic suggestions, but like, just don't just ignore what he can no longer remember, because it is possible that the sort of the seeds of those memories still remain. They just need to be sort of watered a bit, right?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thanks so much. I appreciate you taking the call.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for calling in.
Bye.
Robert in Dallas. I used to live in Texas. Well, I used to live in Houston. I never went to Dallas. Well, I've been through Dallas, but never really went. I loved Houston. One of my favorite cities. Okay. That sweater is so 1960. I would never trust your choices. I love this. This is like one of my favorite sweaters. How dare you? I'm a textures kind of guy. I like textures. But hey, to each your own. Or his own. I guess I don't know if you're male or female. Are there any studies comparing ketamine versus psilocybin? What are your thoughts? Well, sure there are. Yeah. What's interesting about my recent conversations about our discussion of psilocybin for the treatment of depression is that's a sort of a new endeavor in psychiatry or whatever, in medicine. But prior to psilocybin receiving attention, ketamine was identified as a potential treatment for depression. And it's been basically it's been verified. Like the question is no longer whether or not ketamine might be beneficial for some people with depression, but rather why it's effective for some people. Like why why is it that some people, particularly people with severe depression, with treatment-resistant depression, why they react therapeutically, why there's a benefit. And there are some interesting theories involving the cortex, involving like the relationship between the cortex and other parts of the brain, particularly mood regulating parts of the brain, in that, a couple exposures to ketamine can sort of recalibrate the excitatory relationship between cortical neurons. I mean, when I say cortex, I mean like the outer layers of the brain. The human neocortex is quite large, and probably a major reason for why we have this complicated consciousness relative to other animals who all have smaller cortices. But anyways, ketamine, the thought is that it sort of changes the excitatory, the activating signals that come from the neocortex down to the more primitive parts of the brain that I studied that regulate mood. Whereas psilocybin, and that would make sense because ketamine, again, is glutamatergic. It binds NMDA receptors that typically bind glutamate, or that do bind glutamate. And that's a little bit more complicated than that, I guess. But and so that would make sense, right? So glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Whereas psilocybin is serotonergic. And so the thought there is, so serotonin is well established to play a very important role in regulating mood. Of course, the vast majority of antidepressants are serotonergic. They're SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Some are SNRI, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. But broadly speaking, serotonin has sort of ruled the mood regulatory, throne for many, many years. Mood is more complicated than serotonin, believe me. And I studied serotonin, so it is sort of near and dear to my heart, among other things, not just serotonin. But anyways, so the thought, I think, is that psilocybin, as a function of its pharmacology, of interacting with serotonin-associated proteins and stuff, but then also the unique psychological state that they induce, that might render people a little bit more receptive to therapy, might be just an alternative, treatment strategy to, while still serotonergic, different pharmacological mechanism. Relative to SSRIs. So, but those are the main differences. Glutamatergic, NMDA, ketamine. Serotonergic, 5-HT2A receptor, psilocybin. Is there a drug that will make me more disciplined? I have no energy at work. I'm stuck in... okay. Is there a drug that will make you more disciplined? Well, listen, I feel your pain. Believe me. Yeah, I mean, that's probably why caffeine is like maybe the second most widely consumed drug by humans. That's what ketamine does, is that it's actually rather different relative to like the classic psychomotor stimulants like amphetamine, but they sort of the consequences of the pharmacological downstream consequences of both caffeine and amphetamine are sort of similar in that you get elevations of a family of neurotransmitters called catecholamines, which include norepinephrine, what you might call noradrenaline, and then epinephrine, or what you might call adrenaline. Because neuroscientists are better than other scientists, we come up with our own names for the same molecules for the brain. So caffeine is a methylxanthine, and it binds adenosine receptors, and the downstream consequence of that is elevated catecholamine signaling, which is why you feel more energy, more stimulation, and that signaling is involved in regulating your motivation to engage in any given task. So not only does it make you feel more energy or like more energetic, but it also, you'll be more likely to assign a level of motivation to a task as a function of those elevated neurotransmitters, or the elevated signaling in the circuits that those neurotransmitters regulate. Very similarly to amphetamine. So caffeine, that's my suggestion. Else, I mean, of course, like it's more important to focus on, are you getting enough sleep? Like that is probably the most underestimated critical feature of your day-to-day life experience. For almost everybody. Like I would be surprised if I would be willing to bet that a majority of Americans, I'm assuming you're American, maybe you're not, but get enough sleep. I would imagine that there's a sort of chronic wide scale sleep deficit. And but motivation, the signaling of those same neurons that I'm referencing when it comes to catecholamines and stuff will be affected by how much sleep you're getting, if you're getting enough sleep. All right. Let's see. It looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
My name is Brendan Dryden.
Hi, Brendan. What's on your mind? All right. Well, Brendan, thanks for calling in. And if anything comes to mind that you're interested in about the brain or, becoming a scientist or anything like that, feel free to bring it up. Okay. Have a good one. That's very cute. It'd be funny so in my mind, I was imagining somebody who was, maybe early teens. It'd be funny if like Brendan was like 65 and just like, yeah, I'm going to go and do that now. Like, I don't know. Okay. What can you tell me by my birth date? When you were born, that would be the first thing I could tell you. But then second thing I could tell you is like where the Earth is relative to the sun. And then probably I could also tell you where like all the other planets were in the solar system. I can also predict your favorite food. One of those is a lie. Okay. Now we have to be worried about Corollas? I know. Tell me about it. Oh, man, I'm so behind. Well, that was bizarre. He's just, young guy. Young guy. Ian, does anxiety cause stress? Retta Moore, yes. Yes, they do. Yes, it does. So they're obviously related, right? So, and the definitions from like a scientific perspective that distinguish anxiety from, let's say, fear and then stress, they're not like very, very, very rigid. And the reason for that is that a lot of the same brain regions that underlie what we call anxiety are also involved in fear and then are also involved in stress. Generally speaking, the sort of main distinction that we make between anxiety and stress is a longer term condition, right? Where, you could be just chronically anxious, right? Some aspect of your life is inducing anxiety chronically. And so you have this state of stress. And generally speaking, anxiety, we think of more as like an acute experience, less acute than fear, which fear is like there's somebody that's threatening to punch you in the face. That might make you fearful. Anxiety is more like you're anticipating that somebody in this area might punch you in the face, right? You've learned from past experiences, from being, told by your parents or by, society, that you're in a spot where you're more likely to get punched in the face, and so you have elevated anxiety. It's a survival mechanism, right? It's to prepare you for the prospect of some threat to your survival. Whereas, so here's like one, possible way that anxiety and stress could be inextricably linked. So if you could imagine, some folks are unfortunate to live in situations where they are under constant threat of being physically abused, whether it's their spouse, their parent, whatever it might be. And that, past experience has instructed a person that this other person is volatile and at the drop of a spoon can abuse the person. And so that is anxiety, right? The anxiety of the prospect of this future doom. But the stress emerges from basically the fact that this is a recurrent experience for that person, that they live in a situation where there's just this chronic threat that they're anticipating. And so yeah. And generally speaking, stress is more associated with hormonal signaling or endocrine signaling. So these are like, longer term sort of the release of glucocorticoids like cortisol. Cortisol and stress are essentially synonyms from like in the minds of a lot of scientists. More complicated than that, but so yeah. And then whereas anxiety is like, you are anxious in this moment, and then the next moment you are not, hopefully. All right, so it looks like Brendan might be calling back in. Oh, no, okay. All right. Oh, we are getting another call. Cool. Let's see where we go. Oh, that's unfortunate. Tiger, you've tried calling in more than once. I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry to see that the system didn't work. So on YouTube, we have, interesting. If I understand correctly, delusional states, low level, last longer than hallucinations, high level. So it's actually the reverse, Frank. So the lower level. So I'm talking about what I talked about earlier on YouTube, youtube.com. Oh my gosh, I still have this picture up. I did a deep dream on my face, and it looks wild. So you can check that out, youtube.com/anthropoid. But anyways, I talked about why we have hallucinations, specifically in the case of people with schizophrenia, but not exclusively. Theoretically, it could also apply to when people take hallucinogenic drugs. So the low and it sort of it emerges from this model that is proposed that there are lower level processes and higher level processes. Lower level processes are like the incoming sensory information, like literally your ability to see things and most commonly hear things, whereas higher level is your ability to understand those things. Like for example, you can see right on top of my hand right there, you can see a flower, right? And that lower level information is delivering to you via the patterns of photons hitting your eyes that this is the shape of a flower. But then that's the lower level. The higher level is like your ability to understand that it would be strange if I started eating that flower, because that people don't eat orchids, and also it would just be strange if I started eating flowers while I'm talking about this topic, right? That's the higher level. And so hallucinations, this theory proposes, emerge from disruptions of the lower level processes, whereas delusions arise from the disruptions or differences in the way that the brain regions that encode cognition, recognition, these types of things, disruptions of those structures. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, that's the idea. Yeah, it's crazy. I never heard that I live in 5. I feel like I would have even been 6. That is a core component for me, everyday existence. Very interesting. Yeah, I assume you're referring to like the aphantasia, right? Yeah, I know. It's funny because like it's so personal. Like people, like I got very emotional reactions. Like some of the scientists were like, "Dude, this is just we don't know what each other mean. Like your definition, your understanding of the word visualize is just different. So we're not all calibrated properly." But the people who have studied this have tried to control for that, and it seems to not be the case. It seems that there's just a difference in the way that people are able to visualize things, and frankly, that kind of does make sense, right? That like there would be differences. Why wouldn't there be? There are differences in essentially every other aspect of consciousness. Why would visualization be somehow privileged or unique or different? Why do I get horny? Well, evolution, my dear Watson. Evolution. Evolution, Morpheus. Evolution. Basically, it's because that is evolution's way, that is the invisible hand of natural selection. That is a mechanism that evolved in primate brains, in the brains of many animals, but certainly primates included, to drive you to engage in behaviors that are not immediately beneficial to your like immediate survival, like eating food, that kind of thing. But it's very, very important for your genes to propagate, right? Sometimes a baby is just a gene's way of making another gene, right? So that's why is that it's a very primitive part of the brain, because this is a very early evolutionary sort of strategy that emerged to reproduce. But that's why. Yeah. Is not sleeping a physical or mental thing? Well, it's a little bit of both. So Riverboy. But when you say physical, I mean, mental things are physical things. Okay, so mental things are physical things. So mental, your desires, your love, your hate, your hunger, your all of it emerges from physical events that occur in the brain. And so there's no distinction. Like I've heard when it comes to like addiction, people will say heroin is both physically and psychologically addictive, whereas cannabis is only psychologically addictive. And that distinction like doesn't exist. Like that's not a distinction that occurs within that is used within the literature, because all of it is physical. I mean, there's no component of human psychology that doesn't have some physical substrate, some physical underlying structure within the brain that enables it to happen in the first place. But to take your meaning a little bit further, lack of sleep has physical ramifications too, like for your body, non-nervous system functions. So yeah, it is both physical and mental from that perspective. Do I need to keep asking? Oh, I'm sorry. My little MMA 6. Let's see. I'll see if I can find your topic. And again, third time. Yeah, I apologize. I mean, I try to give people thorough responses, and so it can take me a little while, but I appreciate your patience. Third time. What can you tell me about autism to help me explain my autism to others? Oh, okay. So autism is very complicated. Autism is a very sort of diverse spectrum, right? We now use the term autism spectrum disorders, and the reason for that is that there's different manifestations of autism. First of all, there can be what some call high functioning autism, or mild. It's like there are just some differences in the way that you interact with the world. And then there's debilitating autism, where people just literally cannot function independently, and they share certain elements, which is why they're under the same umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. But there is this variability in the manifestations of the condition. So at its core, autism is a byproduct of the fact that parts of your brain are just unique, or different relative to the brains of others or people without autism. And there are some consistent there are some consistent features of the brains of people with autism, but there can be differences. And so just to give you an idea, like probably part of the reason for why there's such a wide variety is that there have been dozens, hundreds, thousands of genes that have been implicated in autism and predicting whether or not somebody will have it, or that are consistently, different in the, genomes of people with autism relative to those without. And you don't have to have all of them. You don't have to have all of the same forms of all of those thousands of genes to have autism. It can just be a couple. But if you have that collection of unique genes, then you have an increased likelihood of exhibiting autism, right? And so there's a bunch. So like one is a gene called SHANK3, which is basically it's a sequence for a family of proteins that are like the scaffolds of postsynaptic density. So basically like the scaffolding of some of the structures of neurons, that's namely the regions of neurons that communicate with one another, like the areas like the scaffolding that connects receptors and channels and membrane proteins to the cytoskeleton, so to the actual structure of neurons. And so that's one example. I mean, there's a bunch. There's like actually the lab of somebody who I think is absolutely brilliant, with whom I worked sort of indirectly. Our labs worked really closely together. Named Mark Ficillo. He's at Penn, and he's an MD PhD, and he studies essentially the genetic, both the neuroscience and the genetics of autism. And so basically like the genes that he's focused in on are neuroligin, and basically like genes that encode for proteins that enable neurons to like interact with one another, to like form connections in the first place. And so as a result, these are like very fundamental regulatory genes that like determine the anatomy of your brain. And if you have a slight unique, if you have a unique form of those genes, your neurons will then form in unique ways, or communicate with, form circuits in unique ways. And so as a result, when it comes to consciousness and human behavior, the physical structures of the brain would determine all of that. And so and it's not necessarily a bad thing or disadvantageous, particularly as broader society is coming to understand and recognize autism. But it can make functioning more difficult. And so from my perspective, and this is somebody I don't have autism as far as I'm aware, at least I don't think so. And it doesn't personally affect me directly, but I would imagine that for at least a large cohort of people diagnosed with autism, the goal isn't to cure it or to make their brains the same as the sort of the middle most common average human brain. By the way, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as an average human brain, but rather to sort of like ADHD, like to help folks have the tools, whether they're medications, whether they're behavioral, psychological, whatever it is, to enable them to function, right, with a high quality of life, but then also exploit the fact that they do have these unique brains that affords them unique perspectives that just wouldn't ever occur to me, or somebody without. So but at its core, it seems to be a byproduct of unique ways that neurons form circuits within the brain of those with autism. By the way, there's a new treatment that recently came out for autism. One of the like hallmark symptoms or components of autism are social deficits, or basically differences in the way that people with autism socially interact with one another. And it can be sort of bucketed in with anxiety, but also just differences in the way that like facial perception works in folks with autism. Like if you watch, you can track like what eyes are looking at very, very precisely. And so they're called eye tracking studies, conveniently. But anyways, if you were to track my eyes, you were to show me a bunch of pictures of people's faces, and then you ask me, hey, what mood is this person in? And you give me a picture of somebody like that, or a picture of somebody like, or, whatever, just a bunch of faces. And you track where my eyes went. They would focus in on the eyes, on the eyes of the picture, and the eyebrows, the mouth area, and just really sort of like go back and forth between those structures. Whereas somebody with autism, if you track their eyes, there's no like focus of attention. It's not like they're not honing in on the most expressive parts of the faces, which are eyes, eyebrows, mouth, that kind of stuff, and so just social deficits like that. Romidepsin, which is a medication that I think it's used to treat cancer, but evidently not exclusively, in animal models of autism, seem to restore those social deficits, right? So like mice and rats, just like humans, are very, very social critters, right? And they have very classic, they groom each other, they have very classic sort of social interactions. And in models of autism, they don't, right? Similarly to humans, they have these social deficits. They behave in different ways. And so this medication seemed to restore sort of normal rodent behavior. So, interesting little thing I always forget to bring up. That was a couple months ago, I think, at this point, though. Okay. Does vortioxetine help with brain fog due to anxiety? I'm not familiar with that drug. Is it an SSRI? Sounds like it. Sounds like it's an analog of like fluoxetine or something, or fluvoxetine. If it is, it could. SSRIs can be quite helpful for people with diagnosed anxiety. So yeah, I mean, I'm unfamiliar with that specific drug. And importantly, when it comes to that category of drugs, SSRIs, SNRIs, blah blah blah, they're all very similar pharmacologically. They all do very similar things, but they bind to proteins in unique ways. And so there are what are called pharmacogenomic differences, meaning there are differences in the way that your brain and my brain will react to the same drug. They'll broadly be very similar, but I might react in just a slightly different way relative to you. That would then make this drug, vortioxetine or whatever, more therapeutically beneficial for me than it is for you, or vice versa. It's the same fundamental concept that underlies why some people are more vulnerable to developing addiction to opioids like oxycodone or heroin relative to other people who find those drugs awful. It makes them nauseous and they feel stupid and confused and stuff, and sometimes even dysphoric, the opposite of euphoria. Same fundamental principle is that the genes that underlie how our brains interact with these drugs are just different in people. All this to say, that's why people oftentimes there's a bit of trial and error that has to happen for somebody who's pursuing a pharmacological treatment for a mood-related psychiatric condition. They have to frequently try several before they find one that is, groovy, that grooves with them. All right. How to help my mom's brain? She is 92. Well, eat fruit. I mean, congratulations. That's not young. So there's something good about her biology if she is able to live this long already. So whatever she's been doing has been pretty good. But fundamentally, when it comes to the sort of age-related cognitive decline that we all experience, but some experience to a greater extent, can be mitigated by a handful of things, right? So like the most, central one is continuing to intellectually challenge your brain, whether that's continuing education, which is sort of a metric we use. Like, just to give you an example, it turns out that people who have pursued education for a longer period of time, whether it's trying to, going to get a master's degree, or, go to college, get a master's degree or whatever, that just equates to a longer period of time being forced to learn new things, right? So it's just this handy way of measuring, duration of intellectual engagement. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to go to school for that to happen. You can just continue learning new things. You don't need a teacher to guide you through it. And so, but it turns out that people with higher levels of educational attainment tend to have lower frequencies of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So, continuing to challenge your brain, making sure that you're not socially isolated. That's another one. Moderate exercise has been shown to be beneficial, like 30 minutes of cardiovascular exercise a couple days a week. But those first two, social isolation and intellectual engagement, those are the things that are within your power, that can yield benefits. So Tiger Bad Boy, where are you calling from, and what's on your mind?
From Canada. I've spoken to you before.
Oh, right on.
Familiar with you speak to a lot of people, so hard to remember everybody. So my question is about dreaming. Okay.
All right.
So, every time we get a good night's sleep, do we dream?
Gotcha. Yeah. So, let's step back a little bit. So what are dreams, right? We don't know precisely, but here's what we do know fairly confidently is that dreams seem to likely arise during a certain phase of sleep, not the entire time, but during, or at least the more complicated dreams that you might remember during a phase of sleep called REM, rapid eye movement. And that's because we think if you measure brain activity during that period of time, patterns of brain activity look it's just a lot more active. Parts of the brain that were silent before become active again. It's not identical to when you're awake. Like, certain parts of the brain are still inhibited, notably the forebrain, but it's more similar to when you're awake than other periods of sleep. So there's that. Second of all, why? What's the point? And it's unlikely that. So dreams likely arise from that pattern of brain activity I was just talking about during REM. And so why does that pattern of brain activity occur? So there are a couple of theories. The most convincing to me, for the sake of brevity, is that when we're developing in the womb, right? There's automatic activity that's just spontaneous. It just emerges from all the neurons that are growing, because for them to form the connections that they need to make, there needs to be activity. So it's just automatic. It just comes on, and it turns out that the time of your whole life cycle during which you have the greatest amount of this REM sleep-like activity is when you're actually still in the womb. So it likely is associated with some kind of anatomical, orchestrating connectivity between different neurons. And so that makes sense, because if you deprive somebody of REM sleep, it becomes much more difficult for them to learn anything relative to somebody who gets REM sleep. But so the dreams are probably what's called a spandrel, which is a wonderful term. I recommend you check it out. But basically, it is sort of ornamentation, or it's like it's not the centrally important thing. It's just a byproduct of something that is centrally important. So, when you have a good night's sleep, what is a good night's sleep? A good night's sleep is, more than one or two cycles through the entire sleep cycle, and so you're going from stage 1 to REM multiple times. And so that's usually about 6 to 8 hours for most people. There's some interesting, what appear to be genetic differences in how much sleep people require. But, it's generally, some people can get away with 4 hours of sleep and they're, right as rain. But generally speaking, around 6 to 8 hours. And so it's not that you're having dreams that is what makes for a good night's sleep, but rather that you've gone through all of those cycles enough times. And if you happen to go through those cycles, you are also very likely to experience dreams right? So does that make sense?
Okay. Well, yeah, that makes sense. But okay, so now, why is it then that some days I wake up and I remember vivid dreams, other days I don't? So another follow up is that are we dreaming every night and just sometimes we wake up and remember them and sometimes we don't? And is it possible that our brains, even though I don't remember them, is it still recorded does our brain still record them?
I love the topic. Here we go. I love this topic. So first of all, we don't know with 100% certainty why it is that some dreams are memorable and some are not. There are some great theories. Here's my favorite. So in the brain, right? You have tons of experiences moment to moment, right? And I think it's uncontroversial to suggest that some experiences are more important than others, right? When you propose to your spouse, that's a more important experience than, the fact that you brushed your teeth this morning, right? And so, and that the reason, and so that's objectively true, right? And so also the brain has limited resources. It's expensive to have a brain from like an energy perspective, and it has limited resources. And so, there's no justification, and probably there's some disadvantages if we remembered every single thing that happened to us, right? There's some people that argue that they do, but it's exceedingly rare, and that hasn't even been verified. So there is this importance detector that is at play in the brain. And so when you think back to an experience, an important experience, what comes to mind? For me, it is the sensory experiences, the emotional experiences that I had in those moments, but also like I can remember what it smelled like when the football field was mowed, right? I can conjure that smell, or I can remember what my wife looked like when I proposed to her at a fire tower in whatever Western Pennsylvania, and so it's those sensory experiences, right, coupled with the mood. But when you're your story, that is the entirety of the memory is sensory, mood, emotional experiences, what you were thinking at the time, all that kind of stuff, right? So when you're asleep, when you're dreaming, there is no incoming sensory information. It's all spontaneously generated, and in other words, it's inwardly generated. You're not taking in visual information. You're not really taking in, smell. You can take in some auditory, but you're generally, if it's too loud, you're going to wake up. And so as a result, my favorite theory for why it is that some memories are some dreams are memorable, whereas some aren't, is that the absence of that sensory information renders those dreams implicitly less important. And so implicitly less worthy of storage, of remembering.
Sometimes if you can't sleep, right? I can't sleep. I'm overtired or whatever the reason may be. And if I take a sleeping pill or a Tylenol with opioid in it, right? It puts me to sleep, and then I find out that in the morning you have more vivid dreams. Now, is it because the pill made you get a better sleep, or is it something in the pill that triggered the sleep? That's basically it.
You're speaking my language, man. I love this topic. So first of all, just so everybody knows, in Canada, you can get Tylenol with small bits of codeine in it legally. Like he's not admitting that he's doing illegal drugs, right? Yeah. It's T3 Tylenol. But anyways, so first of all, okay, so you're specifically referring to an opioid. That's the psychoactive component of the Tylenol with codeine, right? It's the codeine. And right, and so opioids. There is a variety of drugs that are known to be associated with more vivid dreams. So just to give you an example, opioids for sure. But then also nicotine is like notorious for inducing very vivid dreams and even helping people to remember dreams. And in fact, there's a community of people who will use nicotine patches, that people use to stop smoking.
Yeah.
While they're asleep. They'll just put it on, then go to sleep, just in pursuit of those very vivid dreams, and perhaps in some cases it might make them more likely to have a lucid dream, or at least at a minimum remember it. But, there are other drugs too. And so on the flip side, there are drugs that inhibit, that make you less likely to remember a dream. But frankly, it's because they alter that cycle, that sleep cycle. So, a normal sort of orchestration of your sleep cycle, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3/4, and then REM, and then back to 1, right? And that is all, regulated neurobiologically, right? Certain neurons have to come on, certain neurons have to shut up, and then there's a sort of handoff of activity. And all drugs will influence, like any psychoactive drug will influence that progression. And so alcohol, for example, it's well known, it has sort of sedative properties, but it's also well known for, depriving, sleep of its nutrition, right? Where you don't have that accurate, or that normal progression through the stages of sleep, and it disrupts your ability to have REM sleep. You never really get to REM sleep. You get a little bit, but not nearly as much. And so, so that's why, and that's true for cannabis too, by the way. But yeah, so now why is it that the drugs that do sort of amplify dreams, make them more vivid, why do they do that? It's an interesting question, and frankly, I don't think we know enough about both the pharmacology of these drugs, but also the relationship that the brain regions with which they interact have with REM sleep and dreaming and conscious more broadly. But at a minimum, what we do know is that the reason is that all of these drugs manipulate or influence your progression through your sleep phases. That's the fundamental reason.
Okay. It's a lot to think about, man. Thank you very much.
Thanks for calling in. Super interesting topics. Talk to you again. Friends from Canada. What was that word again? Spandrel. Oh, no, okay. We're good. Everybody calm down. Okay. All right. I sleep with melatonin. I feel really rested. Yeah, melatonin does seem to be more effective for some people than others. It doesn't do anything for me, like anything. I'm really, really bad at sleeping. I have been ever since puberty, and it runs in my family, and melatonin just does not do the trick. And I gave it a shot. Believe you me, my friend. If Tiger's homosexual because he is, pretty obvious. Is that a chemical imbalance in your brain? Well, I don't know about Tiger, but it's not an imbalance. It's just a difference in the way that, the brain of somebody who's attracted to a different, sex or gender has relative to you. Like I could just as easily ask, like, what is it about you that makes you heterosexual? I assume you're heterosexual. Like, what's going on? What's going wrong in your brain, right? It's like literally an equivalent question. Cool. I think it's either psychotic or psychic Brian. Is that your name, Brian? And if so, where are you calling from?
Yeah, that's my name, Brian, and I'm calling from Virginia.
Awesome. Brian in Virginia. What's on your mind?
I've been following you for a while. Just wanted to ask you, have you done any studies or looked at the literature on ketones, the effect of ketone in the brain? There's a lot of good research coming in that ketosis with the ketone diet or the carnivore diet has an effect on the brain. A lot of doctors are using this in their practice, the keto diet, to help with anxiety and depression. And I want to know if you've seen any good literature on ketones and the effect on the brain.
Yeah, so super interesting topic. So just so everybody's on the same page, ketones or ketone bodies are molecules that are produced. Sort of when you're in a state of low levels of carbohydrates in your diet. So most of our diets, if you have anything resembling like a remotely competent diet, that's like normal, let's say. Has a distribution of carbohydrates, fat, and then protein, right? Those are like the main, what we call macronutrients. And generally speaking, our cells are able to produce ATP, the sort of main energy molecule, through a couple of different mechanisms. But the main one, the most efficient one, is through carbohydrates. And so as a result, our bodies will preferentially burn carbohydrates for energy to make ATP. But in the absence of carbohydrates, our bodies are also able to make ATP from fat. And to do that, it's a totally different process, and it's actually it's like more laborious biochemically speaking. But to generate energy using fat, your body has to generate ketone bodies. Before like the ketogenic diet and the carnivore diet sort of came into vogue, I remember doctors would physicians would like regularly be like, ketones are fundamentally bad, and it's because people with diabetes, they end up, for one reason or another, type 1 or type 2, they end up they end up in a state of ketosis or ketone acidosis, and this is because they have a lot of glucose in their circulatory system, but they're not able to use it or like to put it where it needs to go. And so usually it's like a sign of, if a diabetic has very, very high levels of ketones, that's a bad thing. But when it comes to, people without diabetes who are interested in these alternative diets, which, by the way, I for a very long time, I followed what was a ketogenic diet. I wasn't measuring ketone levels because it was kind of hard to do it at the time, or expensive to do it. But I did that, and I'm a proponent of it. But so anyways, what those diets are, and I'm sorry, Brian, this is just probably excruciating for you, but just so everybody is sort of on the same page. What those diets are just diets that either completely eliminate carbohydrates or minimize them to very, very, very low levels that would strike most people as being ridiculous. Like just a couple sips of Sprite or Coca-Cola, and you don't have a ketogenic diet anymore, right? Anyway, so these are diets that have a lot of fat in them. So like avocados, protein, animal fat, and butter, and a lot of coconut oil. These are the sources that people have for fats in their diet to crank that up, or seeds and stuff like that. Anyways, so ketogenic diets are interesting from a neurobiological perspective for a couple of reasons. The first, the most uncontroversial, is that for some children with epilepsy, for whom no treatment is reliably working very well, and they're still having seizures, it turns out that if they transition to a ketogenic diet, the frequency of their seizures drops very significantly, almost like it's a therapeutic. We still, at this point, there was a study that came out. I'm failing to remember though, but basically we don't really know by what mechanism a ketogenic diet mitigates the frequency of seizures in these children. We don't know it, but it has been pretty, consistently identified and characterized. What we do know for sure is that there are just completely independent biochemical cascades that are involved in harvesting ATP, basically from ketones or from fat, that are just independent from the sort of classic carbohydrate glucose-related pathways. And so it might be the case that, for somebody who's prone to seizures, to having, neurons fire at frequencies that are irregular and potentially dangerous, that carbohydrates, because they're so much easier to burn, provide energy on demand. And so they're not limited. The activity of these neurons isn't limited by the amount of energy available at any one moment, whereas for ketones, it's just a longer process. So it could just be that simple. Okay, so there's that. There's also studies that suggest that the ketogenic diets, or diets that sort of prioritize fat above carbohydrates, can be associated with cardiovascular benefits, can be associated with longevity benefits. But again, I've not seen any good mechanistic explanations for why or how. It's more just statistically, we look at several hundred people, or it's usually not that big, but a ton of people, and they tend to have lower incidences of heart disease, which is one of the main sources of fatality in the United States, and et cetera, and longer lifespans and these types of things. And so, but yeah, in terms of what it is that's different about a ketogenic diet or ketones within the nervous system that explains all of these differences, I've never seen a solid mechanistic explanation, but I haven't looked in now for several months. So I'll keep an eye out, and I'll do some homework before next week, so I can have something better for you.
Have you heard in your circles that the ketones are neuroprotective? Where I'm seeing some trickles of literature come out for people that have early dementia. The ketogenic diet might be helpful in restoring dopamine synapses and just be more effective for utilizing neurotransmitters. Or have you heard anything that, or just being plain neuroprotective?
Well, so certainly in the case of somebody with epilepsy, for whom the ketogenic diet has reduced their seizures, it is by definition neuroprotective, right? Because when people are having seizures, within a couple minutes, neurons can begin to die. Depends on where in the brain the seizures are occurring, but broadly speaking, priority number one when somebody's having a seizure is stop the seizure. And so so for them, it is neuroprotective. I haven't seen any studies that would suggest it's neuroprotective. Okay, so let's take an example of somebody who might be interested in, recovering from dopaminergic damage, like somebody who took methamphetamine at high doses for years, right? You can be fairly confident that those dopamine-producing neurons in the ventral tegmental area, that they've lost some of those, and so as a result, they just don't produce as much dopamine as they would otherwise. I could imagine that, that there might be some mechanism by which a ketogenic diet might limit the possibility of further deterioration of those dopaminergic neurons, and in which case that would be neuroprotective. I've never seen any evidence that it does that they're capable of doing that, and frankly, I would be skeptical. And also, like, unless you have Parkinson's disease or you have had a history of using those types of drugs at high doses for, in the past for a while, there's no reason to suspect that you are at some dopaminergic deficit as a function of some kind of damage to your brain, right? Rather, if you feel like you don't have enough energy, or, you feel like you used to be happier and the same things that gave you joy no longer do, then it's unlikely that there's something that's damaged your dopamine neurons that therefore requires some kind of therapeutic to recover. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, rather it is, yeah.
Well, what about anxiety, where the certain communities are coming back, the psychiatric communities are coming back and saying, hey, this is very effective. This diet is very effective for our patients that have mild to severe anxiety.
Yeah.
Do we know what symptoms, are working in the brain that reduced, the anxiety from a ketogenic diet?
So I've seen those, but it's important to keep in mind that those are purely correlational studies, and so there is no mechanism. So the kind of science in which I'm trained is not we try to be as uncorrelative as possible, right? As we focus on cause, right? And so and that's not to say that these findings are inconsequential or they're wrong. It just means that there are so many other potential explanations for reductions in anxiety. Anxiety is so complicated. It involves so many components of the brain that, it could be as simple as these folks, they were told, hey, follow this diet. We have a hypothesis that it'll reduce your anxiety. And so just the act of doing something, doing anything, it could just be doing a handstand 5 times a day, just the belief that they're engaging in some kind of process that'll help them could be enough to mitigate their anxiety to tolerable levels.
Yep.
On the flip side, it could also be the case that there are certain neurons in the brain, perhaps the neurons that I studied when I was focused on anxiety, that are a little bit hyperactive for whatever reason, from past life experiences, past life trauma, due to genetic reasons, that circuit just happens to be more active in their brain. And so therefore, if you can mitigate if you can lower the ceiling of their activity by restricting how much energy is available at any one time, then therefore you'll reduce the activity in that circuit. Similarly to what the reason that a benzodiazepine like alprazolam is anxiolytic, reduces anxiety. You're just reducing the activity across the board in the brain. And because in your brain, in this unique moment, activities in certain parts of the brain are elevated, and therefore you're experiencing anxiety, if you just reduce activity across the board, then all of a sudden you go beneath that threshold of anxiety and you no longer feel it. And so, that could also be an explanation. It could be causative. But anyways, yeah. So that's my sort of perspective on it. I find it very interesting. And back when the world becomes normal again, or some new normal, I'm almost certainly going to be pursuing a ketogenic diet again. Yeah. But anyways, yeah, Brian, thanks for calling in, man. A really interesting topic.
Thank you.
Let's see. Where are we? Who am I? What's happening? Okay. Maybe just a couple more minutes. It's not that late. All right. Bye, chicos. Nice talking to spectators as well. Yeah. eLife. Is that your name? eLife Dina? It'd be cool if your name was eLife, because the journal I talked about on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, where I talked about why and how humans have hallucinations, was published in a journal called eLife. It's kind of funny. It's a good journal, by the way. Oh, you know what's cool about eLife? I neglected to mention this. First of all, it's open access, so you can get it. You don't have to pay $30 for one journal article, which is thoroughly abusive and awful. But also, they do this interesting thing where they make their peer review public. So you can see what other scientists, when they were submitted this journal for peer review, what they said, which I think is so cool. And you can learn a lot from the process of science by diving into those. Yeah. Oh, thank you for this talk. It was nice coming across this broadcast. Had to leave. Oh, of course. Yeah, no, thanks for joining in. Hope to see you again. DMT, we can talk about what is normal. Can you talk about DMT and the effects to the brain? Is it damaging? So Captain Obvious. Whoa. Okay. We're good. Everybody calm down. So DMT, for anybody that's unfamiliar, is dimethyltryptamine. It is a psychedelic hallucinogen in the same category of drugs as LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, or psilocybin in magic mushrooms, or mescaline. However, its closest cousin, DMT's closest cousin, is likely psilocybin, which is a DMT molecule with a added little phosphate group in the 4 position, 4-phosphoryl dimethyltryptamine. When you eat psilocybin, by the way, it becomes psilocin in your body, which is 4-hydroxyl dimethyltryptamine. So if you're sensing a theme here, then you would be correct, because it's the dimethyltryptamine that is the theme. And so in any case, this family of drugs, it is very interesting. It's understudied. It's getting more attention. I think I've talked about it now like 4 times on YouTube already. YouTube.com/anthropoid, by the way. But it's getting more attention now. This family of drugs suffered a sort of unique status of taboo, where scientists just did not want to study it. For a variety of reasons we can get into if you're interested. But as a result, we don't know as much about this family of drugs as we should. But relative to other drugs that people do for fun, right? So alcohol, cocaine, amphetamine, and so on. There isn't evidence that this, broadly speaking, this family of drugs is damaging to the brain in the same ways. There's not a lot of evidence that some of them can be. Some psychedelics can be. Most notably the halogenated amphetamines, so 2CI, 2CB, and these hallucinogens that have a sort of amphetamine backbone. But when it comes to what are sort of colloquially termed the tryptamines, dimethyltryptamine, right? This would also include LSD. There's just not a lot of evidence that they are excitotoxic or neurotoxic, certainly at the doses that people regularly take. And in fact, the LD50 of LSD is like very high. It's kind of crazy how high it is. And it's kind of crazy how much people have taken before. Like, just to give you a sense, like a normal dose of LSD is like, let's say 100 micrograms, so invisible, right? People have taken like visible amounts of LSD and was unpleasant, I'm sure, but they recovered okay. When it comes to, I would never feel comfortable suggesting that these molecules do not damage the brain. However, there's not a lot of evidence that they do induce damage to neurons, that they kill neurons, akin to the way that actually MDMA at very, very high doses can, or other amphetamine type molecules. But that doesn't mean that they're benign, and it doesn't mean that they're totally safe. And frankly, the primary risks potential risks of this category of drugs is not their neurobiology, it's their effects on psychology, right? Which of course resides within neurobiology, but it's, if you have a family history of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or psychiatric conditions in general, then they can be associated with a precipitating psychosis or precipitating those underlying conditions, whereas they might not have emerged or manifested had you not been exposed to this drug, to this family of drugs. By the way, I mean, that's not unique to this family of drugs. That's most notably and actually most commonly associated with cannabis, surprisingly. But any drug can theoretically in somebody precipitate addiction, which is a psychiatric condition. And in most people, it's not the case, but it happens. So what's your current opinion on the kangaroo crisis? I didn't know we were in a kangaroo crisis. Are you serious? We have a COVID-19 crisis, and now the kangaroos are rebelling? I mean, gosh, we just cannot get a break. This 2020. Awful year. Hello, Cheddar Scat. I like sliding through your scope and watching it become nighttime. Yeah, it gets dark so much earlier now. Holy cow, sounds like this speed freak knows his ass. I've often wondered, like, if it were illegal to try just like amphetamine, I've often wondered if that would be like, I'd probably like it too much. That's the thing, Dude, everybody calm down. Okay, you know what? I should probably call it a day. So I have a YouTube channel. It's called youtube.com/anthropoid. And today I talked about why and how it is that we hallucinate, specifically with regards to people with schizophrenia, but also applicable to when people take the drugs I was just describing, DMT, dimethyltryptamine, psilocybin, LSD, and so on. So you can check that out, youtube.com/anthropoid. And if you enjoy these topics, why don't you go ahead and tickle that subscription button. I also have a podcast called Wired to be Weird, and that's where we go into real depth on a lot of these topics. Like dreams, we did multiple episodes on dreams, on whole brain computer interfaces like Elon Musk's Neuralink, and psychosis and anxiety and addiction, and a lot of different topics, dementia. So you can check that out, Wired to be Weird. That's pretty much it. Thanks for joining, and hope to see you around the same time, same place next week, and hopefully at some point also during the week. So hopefully you can catch one of those. But otherwise, have a great week, everybody. See you next time. All right, folks on YouTube, thank you, as always, so much for joining me live. I appreciate it. It looks like some of these videos are beginning to get more views, which is exciting. So I appreciate your support. I really do. And if you have any suggestions for topics, I am all eyeballs. I'm all eyes, I'm all ears. Otherwise, something cool is bound to happen between now and the next time. And we can talk about it next time. So thanks for joining. See you, everybody.